November 19th, 1942. The Volga River. The snow fell in silence over Stalingrad, blanketing the shattered ruins in a deceptive layer of white. Beneath it, the corpses of men from a dozen nations lay frozen in grotesque poses, some clutching photographs, others still gripping rifles with fingers locked by rigor mortis and cold. The temperature had plunged to -20 degrees Celsius. Inside a half-collapsed apartment building on the city's western edge, a German Lanzer, a common soldier named Hans Wegener, scratched a final entry into his diary by the flicker of a dying candle. His hands trembled not from fear, but from starvation. "We have not eaten in 3 days," he wrote. "The rats are gone. Even the horses are gone. We are alone." Outside, beyond the frozen wasteland of rubble and ice, over 300,000 men of the Wehrmacht's 6th Army were about to be encircled, trapped, and systematically erased from existence. This was not a battle. This was annihilation. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and could you have survived what these men endured? The road to Stalingrad began not in the snow, but in the heat of summer 1942, when Adolf Hitler's ambitions turned toward the Soviet Union's industrial heartland. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had driven deep into Soviet territory, but it had failed to deliver the knockout blow the Führer expected. The initial invasion had been devastatingly successful. German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, encircled entire Soviet armies, and come within sight of Moscow's spires. 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers, supported by 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft, had crashed across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. The Red Army, caught unprepared and poorly led after Stalin's purges of the officer corps, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire divisions were annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in massive encirclements at Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The vastness of Russia swallowed the German advance. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, and when winter came, the cold froze men and machines alike. The T-34 tanks of the Red Army proved superior to German panzers in the snow. Soviet resistance stiffened. And then, in December 1941, the counter-offensive at Moscow pushed the Wehrmacht back for the first time. Hitler's dreams of a quick victory evaporated in the frozen fields outside the Soviet capital. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht was regrouping for a new offensive, Operation Blue. The objective was twofold: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus to fuel Germany's war machine and capture Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of the Soviet premier himself. It was not just a strategic prize, it was a symbol. Hitler became obsessed with it. In his mind, the capture of Stalingrad would humiliate Stalin personally, break Soviet morale, and demonstrate to the world that Germany was still the dominant force in Europe. The city of Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga River for nearly 30 miles. It was a major industrial center, home to the Red October steel plant, the Barikady gun factory, and the Duzhinsky tractor works, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks. The factories churned out weapons day and night, supplying the Red Army with the tools it needed to continue the fight. Its capture would sever Soviet supply lines, open the door to the Caucasus oil fields, and split the Soviet Union's southern territories. But more than that, it would deliver a psychological blow from which Stalin might never recover. Hitler issued Directive Number 41 on April 5, 1942, outlining the summer offensive. Army Group South would split into two branches. Army Group A would push toward the oil fields of Baku and Grozny, while Army Group B, led by General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army, would take Stalingrad. It was an ambitious, perhaps too ambitious plan. Germany was already fighting on multiple fronts. The Africa Corps was battling British forces in North Africa. U-boats were waging a deadly campaign in the Atlantic, and the Eastern Front stretched over 1,000 miles. But Hitler was confident. One more push, he believed, and the Soviet Union would crumble. General Friedrich Paulus was a meticulous planner, a staff officer by temperament, not a firebrand like Rommel or Guderian. He was 52 years old, tall and thin, with a receding hairline and a perpetually worried expression. He had spent most of his career behind a desk, planning operations rather than leading them. He was cautious, deliberate, and loyal to a fault, traits that would prove both his strength and his undoing. His Sixth Army was one of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht, battle-hardened from campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. It numbered over 270,000 men at full strength, organized into 13 divisions of infantry and 3 panzer divisions, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth. Together they advanced across the southern steppes in late July and early August, sweeping aside scattered Soviet resistance. The weather was scorching, the terrain open. Temperature soared over 35 degrees Celsius. Panzers churned across the grasslands, leaving columns of dust visible for miles. The Mark III and Mark IV tanks, along with a smattering of captured Soviet T-34s, rolled forward with mechanical precision. Infantry marched behind, their boots kicking up clouds of yellow dust. Morale was high. The soldiers sang marching songs. They wrote letters home, confident they would be back in Germany by Christmas. Victory seemed certain. The Soviets appeared disorganized, retreating in haste. German reconnaissance planes reported minimal resistance ahead. Everything was going according to plan. But the Soviets were preparing. Joseph Stalin had been caught off guard by the German invasion in 1941, and he was determined not to repeat that mistake. The initial disasters, the loss of millions of soldiers, vast territories, and entire armies had shaken him. But Stalin was nothing if not ruthless. He had purged the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s, executing thousands of experienced commanders on suspicion of disloyalty. Now he needed those men. The officers who remained were often incompetent, promoted for political reliability rather than military skill. But Stalin was learning. He began to delegate more authority to capable generals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. He allowed them to plan and execute operations with greater autonomy, and he issued orders that left no room for misunderstanding. In late July 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, known infamously as "Not One Step Back." The order was brutal in its clarity. Any soldier who retreated without authorization would be shot. Blocking detachments, composed of NKVD troops, were positioned behind frontline units to execute deserters. Officers who allowed their units to retreat faced courts-martial and execution. Penal battalions were formed from disgraced officers, political prisoners, and soldiers accused of cowardice. These men were sent into minefields and machine gun fire to clear the way for regular troops. Their life expectancy was measured in hours. The message was clear. Stalingrad would not fall. The city would be defended to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. Stalin personally oversaw the defense. He summoned General Vasily Chuikov, a stocky, battle-scarred officer with a reputation for aggression and stubbornness. "Comrade Chuikov," Stalin said,
"Can you hold Stalingrad?" Chuikov did not hesitate. "We will hold it or die trying." Stalin nodded. "Then go, and do not fail me." By late August, the German advance had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Reconnaissance units reported that Soviet forces were digging in among the city's ruins. Paulus ordered a halt to regroup and prepare for the final assault. His staff officers pored over maps, identifying key objectives: the Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that dominated the city center; the Red October factory; the Barakati gunworks; the grain elevator near the Volga. Each would have to be taken, block by block, building by building. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a massive bombing raid. Over 600 aircraft, Heinkel H-111 bombers, Junkers U-88 medium bombers, and Stuka dive bombers swept over the city in waves, dropping high explosive and incendiary bombs. The attack lasted for 2 days. Firestorms erupted, consuming entire neighborhoods. The wooden structures of the old city were incinerated within hours. Flames rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible from 50 miles away. The heat was so intense that the asphalt in the streets melted. Civilians fled toward the Volga, crowding onto ferries and barges in a desperate attempt to escape. Thousands drowned when the boats were bombed or capsized. Others were crushed in the panic. Estimates of civilian deaths range from 40,000 to 90,000 in those first days alone. The city became a smoking graveyard. But the bombing, as devastating as it was, played into Soviet hands. The rubble created a defender's paradise. Every collapsed building became a fortress, every crater a firing position. The streets choked with debris were impassable to tanks. The Germans would have to fight for every street, every block, every room. And in close-quarters combat, the Soviet soldier, tough, resourceful, and fighting for his homeland, was a formidable opponent. On September 12, 1942, the ground assault began in earnest. Paulus committed his infantry divisions into the city, supported by tanks and artillery. The 71st, 76th, and 295th Infantry Divisions advanced from the north and west, while the 14th Panzer Division pushed toward the city center. The 24th Panzer Division attacked from the south. Artillery batteries pounded Soviet positions with thousands of shells. The air was filled with the shriek of incoming rounds, the thunder of explosions, and the rattle of machine gun fire. German soldiers advanced in waves, crouching low, moving from rubble pile to rubble pile. Smoke and dust obscured vision. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the din. Medics dragged wounded men to cover. The dead were left where they fell. The Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, fell back into the ruins. Chuikov was a short, stocky man with a fierce temper and an unbreakable will. He had fought in the Russian Civil War, in the war against Poland, and in the Winter War against Finland. He was no stranger to hardship. He established his headquarters in a bunker on the banks of the Volga, just a few hundred meters from the front lines. He could hear the gunfire, smell the smoke, feel the concussion of artillery strikes. He refused to retreat across the river. "We will defend Stalingrad or die in it," he told his officers. "There is no land beyond the Volga." The fighting became intimate and savage. German infantry advanced in small groups, clearing buildings room by room. They used flamethrowers to burn out Soviet positions, demolition charges to collapse walls, and grenades to clear cellars and basements. Soviet defenders used every tactic imaginable: booby traps, snipers, night raids, close-quarters ambushes. They hid in sewers and underground tunnels, emerging behind German lines to attack supply columns and headquarters units. The Red Army developed a doctrine they called hugging, staying so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe and artillery could not bomb them without hitting their own troops. Battles raged across distances measured in meters. A German soldier might control the first floor of a building while a Soviet held the second. Hand grenades were tossed up and down stairwells. Men fought with knives, shovels, bayonets, and bare hands. The rules of warfare dissolved. Mercy was a luxury no one could afford. One of the most iconic locations was Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building in the city center. In late September, a platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov fortified the structure and held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. Pavlov was 25 years old, a career soldier who had joined the Red Army in 1938. He was calm, methodical, and utterly fearless. The building overlooked a key square, giving the Soviets observation over German movements. Pavlov's men reinforced the walls with rubble, laid mines around the perimeter, and established firing positions in every window. They knocked holes through interior walls to create hidden passageways. They stockpiled ammunition and food. They even brought in a heavy machine gun and an anti-tank rifle. The building became a miniature fortress. The Germans called it the fortress. They attacked it with infantry, tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. Nothing worked. Every assault was repulsed with heavy losses. German snipers picked off German officers. Machine gunners mowed down infantry as they crossed the square. Anti-tank crews destroyed panzers at point-blank range. The Germans tried flanking maneuvers, night attacks, and massive bombardments. Pavlov's men held on. Soviet propaganda later claimed that more Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. The claim was exaggerated, but the symbolism was real. A single building, held by a handful of men, had become a monument to Soviet resistance.
By mid-October, the Germans had pushed the Soviets back to a thin strip along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters wide. The Red October factory, the barricadi, and the tractor works were contested meter by meter. The factories became battlegrounds. Tanks rolled off the assembly lines and into battle without even being painted. Workers armed themselves with rifles and fought alongside soldiers. Women operated anti-aircraft guns on the factory roofs, shooting down Stukas and Heinkels. The Volga itself became a lifeline. Every night, under cover of darkness, ferries and rafts transported reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies across the river. German artillery pounded the crossings relentlessly, but the Soviets kept coming. Boats were sunk, barges capsized, men drowned in the freezing water, but every night more came. Fresh troops, ammunition, food, just enough to keep fighting, just enough to survive one more day. Soviet snipers became legends. Men like Vasily Zaitsev, who is credited with over 200 confirmed kills, stalked the ruins with bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles. Zaitsev was a shepherd from the Ural Mountains, a hunter since childhood. He understood patience, camouflage, and the art of the kill. He would lie motionless for hours, waiting for a target. German officers were his preferred prey. He would watch them through his scope, studying their habits, their routines, and then, when the moment was right, he would squeeze the trigger. One shot, one kill. The Germans sent their own snipers to hunt him, including, according to Soviet propaganda, a master sniper named Major Erwin Koenig from the Zosen Sniper School. The duel between Zaitsev and Koenig became the subject of legend, later immortalized in books and films. Whether Koenig truly existed is debated by historians, but the psychological impact was real. German soldiers feared moving in daylight. They feared every shadow, every window, every pile of rubble. Death could come from anywhere. Paulus believed victory was within reach. His units had captured 90% of the city. Soviet forces were compressed into a narrow strip along the river, barely 1,000 meters wide in places. Just a final push, he thought, and Stalingrad would fall. But the Sixth Army was exhausted. Casualties were mounting. Entire battalions had been reduced to company strength. Ammunition was running low. Replacements arrived in a trickle.
The men were fighting in temperatures that had begun to drop steadily as autumn gave way to winter. Frostbite cases began appearing in field hospitals. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper and rags. Winter clothing had not yet arrived. The Quartermaster Corps assured them it was on the way. It never came. And then, on November 19, 1942, the trap was sprung. Far to the north and south of Stalingrad, Soviet forces had been quietly massing. Under the direction of General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, the Red Army prepared Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment designed to encircle the German Sixth Army. The plan was audacious. Two powerful armored thrusts would smash through the weaker Romanian and Italian units holding the flanks, then converge behind Stalingrad, cutting Paulus entirely. Zhukov had learned from the Germans. He would use their own tactics against them. The blitzkrieg, the encirclement, the annihilation battle. The planning took weeks. Soviet intelligence identified weak points in the Axis line. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank, was poorly equipped and demoralized. They had outdated weapons, insufficient anti-tank guns, and little artillery support. The Romanian Fourth Army on the south flank was in similar condition. The Italians were even worse off. Soviet planners recognized the opportunity: strike at the weak points, break through, and encircle the Germans before they could react. Over 1 million Soviet troops were assembled in secret. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies were transported under cover of darkness. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Reconnaissance planes were kept away from the assembly areas. The Germans suspected something was coming, but they did not know where or when. Paulus requested reinforcements for the flanks. Berlin denied the request. Every available unit was committed to the assault on Stalingrad. The flanks would have to hold. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery opened fire along the northern front. Over 3,500 guns pounded the Romanian Third Army for 80 minutes. The barrage was apocalyptic. Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs, unleashed salvos that screamed through the air before exploding in massive fireballs. Heavy howitzers fired high explosive shells that cratered the earth. Field guns raked Romanian trenches with shrapnel. Entire battalions were obliterated before they could even respond. Romanian soldiers huddled in their bunkers, praying for the bombardment to stop. When it finally did, they emerged to see a wasteland. Their defenses were shattered, their communication lines were cut, their officers were dead or missing. Then came the tanks. T-34s and KV-1s crashed through the Romanian lines, followed by waves of Soviet infantry. The T-34 was a marvel of engineering, fast, maneuverable, with sloped armor that deflected German anti-tank rounds. The KV-1 was a monster, weighing over 40 tons, nearly invulnerable to Romanian weapons. The Romanians fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Anti-tank guns were overrun. Machine gun nests were crushed beneath the treads of Soviet tanks. Infantry units broke and ran. Romanian officers tried to rally their men, but it was hopeless. By nightfall, the northern pincer had advanced over 50 kilometers. The Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincer launched. Soviet forces struck the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with similar ferocity. Again, the Romanians collapsed. German units, the 29th Motorized Division and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, tried to plug the gaps, but they were too few and too late. Soviet tanks poured through the breach, driving deep into the German rear. Headquarters units, supply columns, and airfields were overrun. Chaos spread. Orders were contradictory. Communication broke down. Commanders lost track of their units. The carefully planned German offensive disintegrated into confusion and panic. On November 22, 1942, the two Soviet spearheads met near the town of Kalach on the Don, west of Stalingrad. Soviet tank crews embraced, celebrating the victory. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history. Paulus radioed Berlin. His situation was desperate. Ammunition was running low. Food supplies were limited. Winter was coming. He requested permission to break out while there was still time. His staff officers urged him to act immediately. A breakout to the southwest might link up with German forces and escape the trap. But Paulus hesitated. He was a loyal officer. He would not act without orders.
Hitler refused. The Führer, advised by Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed the Sixth Army could be resupplied by air. Göring, desperate to restore his tarnished reputation after the Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, boasted that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum needed to sustain the trapped army. Hitler believed him. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe was overstretched, the weather was deteriorating, and Soviet air defenses were growing stronger. In reality, German transport planes, Junkers Ju-52s and Heinkel H-111s, managed to deliver an average of only 90 tons per day. On good days, they managed 120 tons. On bad days, less than 50. It was not enough. Not even close. Hitler issued a direct order. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad at all costs. It would become a fortress. It would tie down Soviet forces and prevent them from advancing elsewhere. Relief would come. Paulus, ever the obedient officer, complied. He ordered his men to dig in. Defensive positions were established around the perimeter of the pocket. Artillery was positioned to repel attacks. The Sixth Army would wait for rescue. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Winter had arrived in full force. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, then lower. The soldiers of the Sixth Army were not equipped for it. They wore summer uniforms with thin overcoats. Winter clothing was supposed to be on its way, but it never arrived. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, ears, noses. Gangrene set in. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Surgeons worked by candlelight in freezing bunkers. The screams of the wounded echoed through the ruins. Horses were slaughtered for food, their meat rationed in tiny portions. When the horses were gone, the men ate whatever they could find: dogs, cats, rats, crows. They boiled leather belts into a tasteless paste. They chewed on boot soles. They scraped frozen soup from the bottoms of empty cans. Hunger became constant, gnawing, unbearable. Men grew weak. They could no longer march. They could barely lift their rifles. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their skin turned gray. They looked like walking corpses. Medical supplies ran out. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Antiseptics were gone. Infections spread. Typhus broke out. Dysentery ravaged entire units. Men lay in filthy bunkers, too weak to move, shivering uncontrollably. The dead were stacked outside like cordwood, frozen solid. There was no time to bury them, no strength, no point. The living barely had the energy to survive. One German soldier, a private named Wilhelm Hoffmann, kept a diary throughout the siege. His early entries were confident, even cheerful. "Today we advanced 10 kilometers," he wrote in August. "The Soviets are on the run. Victory is near." By September, the tone had changed. "The fighting is terrible. We lose men every day." By November, "We are surrounded. They say relief is coming. I hope it is true." By December, "We are hungry. We are cold. We are forgotten." His final entry, dated January 1943, was a single sentence: "God, why have you forsaken us?" Hoffmann's body was never identified.
His diary was found by Soviet troops and archived. It remains one of the most haunting documents of the battle. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's airlift struggled. Transport planes flew into the pocket from airfields at Tatsinskaya and Morozov, over 200 kilometers away. They had to run the gauntlet of Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag GG-3s, and later American-made P-39 Airacobras. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket, filling the sky with flak. Planes were shot down by the dozens. Pilots flew through blizzards, ice forming on their wings, engines sputtering in the cold. Many crashed on takeoff or landing. The airfields inside the pocket were little more than strips of frozen earth, cratered by Soviet artillery. Planes landed, unloaded their cargo, usually ammunition and a few crates of food, and took off again, often carrying wounded on the return flight. The wounded were packed into the fuselage like cargo, lying on the floor, stacked on top of each other. Many died during the flight. Their bodies were thrown out to make room for more. The Soviets tightened the noose. They launched Operation Little Saturn in mid-December, smashing German and Italian forces along the Don River and destroying the airfield at Tatsinskaya. Soviet tanks overran the base, destroying dozens of transport planes on the ground. Pilots scrambled to take off in the chaos. Some made it, many didn't. The loss of Tatsinskaya crippled the airlift. Planes now had to fly from even more distant airfields, reducing the number of flights and the tonnage delivered. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most talented commanders, was tasked with organizing a relief operation. He assembled a powerful force, the 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with elite SS units and the 6th Panzer Division. The operation, codenamed Winter Storm, launched on December 12th. Manstein's panzers drove northeast, smashing through Soviet defenses. They advanced rapidly, covering over 60 kilometers in a week. By December 19th, they were within 48 kilometers of the pocket, close enough to hear the sound of the 6th Army's artillery. Paulus prepared to break out and link up with Manstein's forces. His staff officers drew up plans, units were alerted. But Paulus waited for permission from Hitler. And Hitler, still clinging to the fantasy of holding Stalingrad, refused. He ordered Paulus to remain in place. The 6th Army would not retreat. Manstein's advance stalled. Soviet reinforcements arrived. Counterattacks drove the panzers back. By December 23rd, the relief operation had failed. Manstein withdrew. The 6th Army was alone. Inside the pocket, hope died. The men had believed rescue was coming. Now they realized the truth. They had been abandoned. The officers stopped lying. The propaganda ceased. Reality set in. They were going to die here. Christmas 1942 was the bleakest in memory. Men huddled in bunkers trying to stay warm. There was no rations that day, no celebration. Some sang carols in weak, trembling voices. Others wept. Many simply stared into space, faces blank, minds retreating into numbness. Letters were written home, though no one knew if they would ever be delivered. My dear wife, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Tell the children I loved them. Tell them I fought bravely. Tell them I am sorry I will not see them grow up.
By January 1943, the situation inside the pocket was beyond catastrophic. The Luftwaffe airlift had collapsed entirely. Only a handful of planes still flew, and they could deliver almost nothing. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Rations were reduced to 100 grams of bread per day per man, roughly the size of a bread roll. It was not enough to sustain life. Thousands were dying daily from starvation, disease, and cold, even before the Soviets launched their final assault. The 6th Army had shrunk to a shadow of its former self.
Of the 290,000 men who had been encircled in November, fewer than 200,000 remained alive. The rest were dead or so badly wounded they could no longer fight. Entire divisions had been reduced to battalion strength. Regiments were commanded by captains, companies by sergeants. The chain of command was breaking down. Orders were often ignored. Men stayed in their bunkers, too weak to move. Some simply gave up, lying there in the snow and waiting for death. Soviet intelligence knew the end was near. Stalin ordered the final assault. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets issued an ultimatum to Paulus: surrender or be destroyed. The ultimatum promised honorable treatment for prisoners, medical care for the wounded, and the preservation of officers' personal belongings. Paulus forwarded the ultimatum to Hitler, requesting permission to negotiate. Hitler's reply was swift and unequivocal: surrender is out of the question. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man. On January 10, 1943, the Red Army began Operation Ring, the systematic destruction of the Sixth Army. Soviet artillery pounded the pocket day and night. Over 7,000 guns fired hundreds of thousands of shells. The bombardment was continuous, relentless, overwhelming. There was no respite. The earth shook. Buildings that had somehow remained standing collapsed. Bunkers caved in, burying men alive. Infantry and tanks advanced methodically, crushing resistance sector by sector. Soviet soldiers moved forward in human waves, absorbing casualties, closing the distance, overwhelming German positions through sheer weight of numbers. German units weakened and demoralized, surrendered in droves. White flags appeared. Officers negotiated with Soviet commanders. Some fought to the end, dying in place. Others simply laid down their weapons and waited for capture. There was no shame left. Survival was all that mattered. The pocket was split in two on January 17th. Soviet forces drove through the center, isolating the northern and southern halves of the Sixth Army. Communication between them ceased. Each fought its own desperate, isolated battle. Paulus was in the southern pocket, trapped in the ruins of central Stalingrad. He radioed Hitler repeatedly, begging for permission to surrender. Hitler refused. He sent messages of encouragement, praise, and empty promises. "The Sixth Army has made history," he declared. "Your sacrifice will be remembered forever." On January 26th, the Soviet forces reached the Volga, cutting the southern pocket in half again. German units were now isolated in small groups, scattered throughout the ruins. Organized resistance had collapsed. Men fought from basements and cellars, firing until their ammunition ran out, then surrendering or dying. Some attempted to escape across the frozen Volga, hoping to reach Soviet lines and give themselves up. Most were shot or froze to death. On January 30, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. A symbolic gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to die. But Paulus was done obeying. He had watched his army disintegrate. He had seen his men starve and freeze. He had endured the lies and the betrayal. He chose life. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered his headquarters in the basement of the Univerg department store in central Stalingrad. Soviet officers entered the building cautiously, expecting a trap. Instead, they found Paulus sitting at a table, gaunt, hollow-eyed, defeated. He looked 20 years older than his 53 years. His uniform hung loosely on his emaciated frame. He spoke quietly, formally. "I am Field Marshal Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army. I surrender myself and my remaining forces." He was taken into custody and driven away. He would spend the next 12 years in Soviet captivity. Over the next 2 days, the remaining pockets of German resistance collapsed. Small groups of soldiers, isolated and without hope, laid down their arms. Some refused and fought to the death. By February 2, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. The cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Of the 290,000 men encircled, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet captivity, from starvation, disease, and forced labor in the brutal camps of Siberia. They marched hundreds of miles to prison camps in the dead of winter. They walked through blizzards in rags, without food, without rest. Those who fell were shot. Those who survived the march faced years of hard labor, cutting timber, mining coal, building railroads. They lived on starvation rations, slept in unheated barracks, and died by the thousands. Total Axis casualties, killed, wounded, captured or missing, exceeded 750,000. Soviet casualties were even higher, estimated at over 1.1 million, including civilians. Stalingrad was obliterated, reduced to a wasteland of rubble and bones. Not a single building remained intact. The city that had borne Stalin's name was now a monument to the price of his victory. But the strategic impact was greater than the numbers. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war in the East. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht would never recover its offensive momentum. Germany was now on the defensive, fighting a war it could not win. The Soviets, bloodied but victorious, began the long, grinding advance westward that would end in Berlin 2 years later. In the decades since, Stalingrad has become a symbol of courage, of sacrifice, of the limits of human endurance. Memorials stand where the factories once burned. The Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that witnessed some of the fiercest fighting, is now crowned by a massive statue. The motherland calls, a woman holding a sword aloft, towering over the city. The names of the fallen are carved into stone. Historians debate tactics, strategy, decisions, but for the men who were there, it was simpler. It was survival. It was hell. Hans Wegener, the soldier who wrote in his diary on November 19th, never made it out. His body was found in the spring thaw, frozen in the ruins of the apartment building where he had sheltered. His diary was recovered by Soviet troops and later archived. In it, he wrote one final line, undated. "We came here as conquerors. We will leave as ghosts." The snow that fell over Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 did not just bury buildings and bodies, it buried an entire army. And when the spring came and the snow melted, the bones were still there.